The morning of June 4th, 1942 dawned clear over the Central Pacific, but Admiral Kiichi Nagamo felt an unusual weight pressing against his chest as he stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi. Behind him, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy stretched across the horizon, four magnificent aircraft carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, now sailing toward what many believed would be Japan's final decisive victory in the Pacific War. The massive fleet centered around carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented the sword tip of Japan's naval supremacy. These weren't merely ships. They were floating cities of steel and ambition, each carrying dozens of the world's most experienced naval aviators. The Akagi alone displaced over 36,000 tons and could launch 91 aircraft into battle. Her flight deck, stretching 855 feet, had become a symbol of Japanese technological prowess and military might. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's seminal work, Miracle at Midway, these four carriers represented Japan's most experienced and skilled naval aviation units, having participated in every major Pacific operation since Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Nagumo's orders were clear: destroy the American naval base at Midway Island. Then eliminate whatever remained of the United States Pacific Fleet. Intelligence suggested the Americans had perhaps 2 carriers in the area, manageable opposition for Japan's veteran pilots who had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. The plan seemed flawless, a textbook example of concentrated naval power projection. But 300 miles northeast of Nagumo's position, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the carrier, Yorktown was studying intelligence reports that would have chilled the Japanese commander's blood. American codebreakers had accomplished the impossible. They had cracked Japan's most sensitive naval communications code, revealing not just the timing of the attack, but the precise composition and approach routes of the enemy fleet. Was set for what naval historians would later call the most decisive 6 hours in Pacific naval warfare. 4 Japanese carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Indian Ocean raids, approached their destiny carrying 108 bombers, 108 fighters, and 93 dive bombers. Their pilots had never known defeat, their ships had never retreated, and their confidence bordered on the supernatural dot as the sun climbed higher over the Pacific on that fateful morning. Neither Nagumo nor his aviators could imagine that within hours, the rising sun's seemingly unstoppable advance across the Pacific would not only halt but begin its irreversible retreat toward the Japanese home islands. The 4 proud carriers that had terrorized Allied forces from Hawaii to Ceylon were sailing toward an appointment with destiny that would fundamentally alter the course of World War II. The Japanese push into the Pacific, which had begun with such devastating success at Pearl Harbor, was about to reach its high-water mark at a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Dawn broke over Midway Island as the first wave of Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud of vengeance. Lieutenant Tominaga Joichi led 108 aircraft from the 4 carriers toward the American base, their engines thundering across the morning sky. Below, Marine defenders scrambled to their obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, knowing they faced impossible odds against Japan's experienced Zero pilots. The attack on Midway itself unfolded exactly as Japanese planners had envisioned. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel depots erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and American defensive positions crumbled under the relentless assault. But as Tominaga's bombers wheeled away from their target, the lieutenant's radio crackled with a message that would doom the Japanese fleet: another attack necessary. The airfield remained operational despite the devastating bombing. Admiral Nagumo faced his first critical decision of the day. His second-wave aircraft sat armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, ready to strike any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's request for another strike on Midway meant switching ordnance to high-explosive bombs suitable for ground targets, a time-consuming process that would leave his carriers vulnerable. At 0-7-15 hours, Nagamo made the fateful choice that would echo through history. "Prepare to rearm the second wave for another attack on Midway," he ordered. Across the four carriers, ordnance crews began the dangerous work of removing anti-ship weapons and replacing them with land attack ordnance. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes were stacked carelessly on hangar decks, while new weapons were brought up from magazines deep in the ship's bowels. Naval combat expert John Keegan, in his analysis of the Second World War, noted that this rearming decision created a critical window of vulnerability for the Japanese fleet, as carriers caught in the middle of ordnance changes became floating powder kegs. But even as Japanese crews worked feverishly to prepare their second strike, American scout planes were already reporting the enemy's position back to Admiral Fletcher. At 0-6-0-3 hours, a PBY Catalina flying boat had spotted Nagumo's force, radioing, "Enemy carriers bearing 3-0 degrees, distance 180 miles." The trap that American intelligence had so carefully prepared was beginning to close. Fletcher's response was immediate and decisive. Every available aircraft from carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-damaged Yorktown launched toward the Japanese fleet. 116 dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes rose from American flight decks, their crews knowing this might be their only chance to strike before Japan's superior numbers overwhelmed them. The race against time had begun. Japanese carriers sat vulnerable with ordnance scattered across their hangar decks, while American strike aircraft bore down on them across the empty Pacific. Nagumo's veterans, who had dominated every engagement for 6 months, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives rather than dictating the terms of battle. As the morning sun climbed higher, both fleets hurtled toward a collision that would determine whether Japan's Pacific Empire would expand eastward toward the American coast or begin its long retreat toward the home islands. At 09-20 hours, the first American attack began with the courage of the doomed. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet in a low-altitude approach toward the Japanese fleet. These obsolete aircraft, flying barely 50 feet above the waves, represented everything that was wrong with American naval aviation in early 1942: slow, poorly protected, and armed with defective torpedoes. The Japanese combat air patrol fell upon Waldron's squadron like hawks among sparrows. Zero fighters dove from 8,000 feet, their 20-millimeter cannons and machine guns tearing through the unarmored American torpedo planes. One by one, the Devastators cartwheeled into the Pacific, trailing fire and smoke. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 planes were destroyed, including Waldron himself. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage of his squadron. The slaughter continued as additional torpedo squadrons pressed their attacks. VT-6 from the Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft, while VT-3 from the Yorktown saw 12 of 13 planes shot down. In less than an hour, American torpedo aviation had been virtually annihilated over the Japanese fleet. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu steamed on undamaged, their decks crowded with Zero fighters low on fuel and ammunition from the defensive battle. Admiral Nagamo permitted himself a moment of satisfaction as he surveyed the wreckage floating in his wake. The American attack had been brave but futile, confirming Japanese superiority in both aircraft and pilot quality. His own returning strike from Midway was approaching, requiring immediate recovery operations. The rearming of his second wave continued below decks, with armed aircraft spotted for launch as soon as the first wave landed. According to Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, this apparent Japanese success actually set the stage for disaster, as the failed torpedo attacks had drawn defending fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to high-altitude dive bomber attack. But high above the battle, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in a desperate search for the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and many of his pilots were already considering turning back when McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine, following the destroyer's wake like a highway across the ocean. McCluskey's dive bombers finally sighted their target at 10:22 hours. 4 Japanese carriers spread below them in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The scene resembled a precisely arranged shooting gallery, with each carrier presenting an ideal target for dive bombing attack. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Attack! Attack! The dauntless dive bombers rolled into their 70-degree attack dives, plummeting toward the Japanese carriers at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The morning sun, which had blessed Japanese operations since Pearl Harbor, now worked against them as American pilots dove out of the solar glare toward their unsuspecting targets. The most decisive moments in Pacific naval warfare were about to unfold as American dive bombers screamed down toward 4 proud carriers that had never known defeat. At exactly 10:25 hours, the first 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier Akagi just behind her island superstructure. The explosion detonated among aircraft armed with bombs and torpedoes, creating a chain reaction that transformed the flight deck into an inferno. Admiral Nagumo's flagship, which had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, became a floating hell within seconds. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading VB-6 from the Enterprise, selected the carrier Akagi as his primary target. His bomb penetrated the flight deck near the amidships elevator, exploding in the upper hangar among fully fueled aircraft waiting to launch. The blast ignited aviation gasoline stored for refueling operations, and flames raced through the ship's interior spaces with terrifying speed. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's VB-3 from the Yorktown was devastating the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits within 2 minutes reduced the 18,000-ton carrier to a blazing wreck. Her flight deck, moments before crowded with Zero fighters and Cape bombers, became a twisted mass of steel plating curled upward by internal explosions. The carrier Kaga suffered the most concentrated attack as multiple dive bomber sections selected her as their target. At least 4 bombs struck the veteran carrier, each explosion adding to the destruction. Her forward flight deck erupted upward as bombs detonated among aircraft spotted for launch, while secondary explosions in ammunition storage areas sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison documented in History of United States Naval Operations in World War II that these coordinated dive bomber attacks achieved what no previous naval engagement had accomplished: the simultaneous crippling of multiple aircraft carriers. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The proud ships that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific now wallowed helplessly, their flight decks shattered, their hangar spaces consumed by fire. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew died in the flames, along with decades of naval aviation expertise that could never be replaced. Only the carrier Hiryu, operating slightly separated from her sister ships, escaped the initial American onslaught. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu's bridge, immediately ordered a counterattack. Despite the catastrophic losses around him, Yamaguchi launched every available aircraft toward the American fleet, determined to inflict maximum damage before his own ship inevitably succumbed. Admiral Nagamo, forced to abandon his blazing flagship, Akagi, transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. As he watched 3 of his 4 carriers burning uncontrollably, the architect of Pearl Harbor faced the complete collapse of his strategic plan. The ships that had seemed invincible 6 hours earlier now served as funeral pyres for Japan's naval aviation elite. The scene aboard the burning carriers defied description. On Akagi, damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that had spread throughout the ship's interior. Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered the ship's magazines flooded to prevent a catastrophic explosion, but the fire's intensity made effective damage control impossible. Similar scenes played out aboard Kaga and Soryu, as their crews faced the horrible reality that their ships were doomed. The 6 minutes from 10:22 to 10:28 hours on June 4, 1942, marked the turning point of the Pacific War, as Japan's naval supremacy died in fire and smoke over the Central Pacific. Admiral Yamaguchi's counterattack from the Hiryu struck the American fleet at 12:03 hours with the fury of the desperate. 18 Cape bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, approached the carrier Yorktown through intense anti-aircraft fire. The American ship, already damaged from the Coral Sea battle a month earlier, fought valiantly, but could not escape her fate. 3 bombs struck Yorktown within minutes, penetrating her flight deck and starting serious fires below. The carrier's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties struggled to maintain power and prevent flooding. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship's boilers shut down as smoke filled the engineering spaces, leaving Yorktown dead in the water and vulnerable to further attack. But Yamaguchi wasn't finished. At 2:45 hours, he launched his second and final strike, 10 Cape bombers armed with torpedoes and 6 Zero escorts. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the dawn attack on Midway Island, commanded this desperate mission despite his aircraft carrying a damaged fuel tank that made his return impossible. The torpedo attack achieved what Japanese naval aviators had trained for since childhood: perfect coordination and execution under impossible circumstances. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing severe flooding and a dangerous list. Captain Buckmaster, believing his ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship at 3:00 hours. The American carrier that had helped sink 3 Japanese carriers appeared to be following them to the bottom of the Pacific. According to Robert Ballard's underwater archaeological research detailed in Return to Midway, the Yorktown's damage, while severe, was actually repairable, and the ship might have been saved with more aggressive damage control efforts. Admiral Fletcher, forced to transfer his flag from the listing Yorktown to the cruiser Astoria, faced a critical decision. With Yorktown apparently sinking and Japanese forces still active in the area, the prudent course would be to withdraw his remaining carriers Enterprise and Hornet to safety. But Fletcher understood that Hiryu remained operational and dangerous. The battle would not be won until Japan's last carrier was eliminated. At 5:03 hours, Enterprise launched 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher. These pilots, exhausted from their morning mission against the Japanese fleet, climbed into their aircraft knowing they faced Japan's most experienced carrier and its elite air group. But they also knew that Hiryu represented the last symbol of Japanese naval aviation supremacy in the Pacific. The dive bombers found their target at 6:05 hours, just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Hiryu steamed alone her escort vessels scattered across several miles of ocean, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for a third strike against the Americans. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on his bridge, watched the American dive bombers approach with the fatalistic acceptance of a samurai facing inevitable death. 4 direct hits transformed Hiryu from a proud warship into a blazing wreck within minutes. The bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces, igniting fuel and ammunition that had been carefully positioned for another attack. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as her aviation gasoline supplies caught fire, creating flames visible from 50 miles away. Japan's last operational aircraft carrier in the Central Pacific died as her 3 sisters had died in fire. Smoke and the screams of burning men died as darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of his doomed flagship Hiryu, composing his final message to Combined Fleet Headquarters. "Our 4 carriers have been bombed and burned," he radioed. "We are preparing to ram enemy vessels." The proud officer who had commanded Japan's 2nd Carrier Division since before Pearl Harbor chose to die with his ship rather than face the shame of defeat. Throughout the night, rescue operations continued around the burning carriers. The destroyer Tanakaze approached Hiryu's starboard side, lowering boats to evacuate survivors while flames roared from the carrier's shattered flight deck. Captain Tomio Kaku refused to abandon his command, sending his crew to safety while he remained aboard to ensure the ship's proper destruction. Admiral Yamaguchi made his final decision as dawn approached on June 5th, rather than allow his flagship to fall into American hands. He ordered the destroyer Makigumo to torpedo Hiryu at 0510 hours. The explosion broke the carrier's back, and she slipped beneath the waves within minutes, taking with her the last remnant of the striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. The fates of the other 3 carriers had been sealed hours earlier. Soryu, smallest of the 4, succumbed to her fires first, sinking at 7:13 hours on June 4th after explosions in her torpedo storage compartments tore open her hull. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his ship, singing the traditional naval anthem, Kimigayo, as flames consumed the bridge. Kaga's death throes lasted longer but proved equally final. The veteran carrier, converted from a battleship hull in the 1920s, fought her fires throughout the night with desperate courage. Her crew jettisoned aircraft, ammunition, and anything else that might feed the flames, but the damage proved too extensive. At 7:25 hours on June 4th, magazines deep in her hull exploded, sending the 38,000-ton ship to the bottom in less than 5 minutes. Naval architect D.K. Brown's technical analysis in Nelson to Vanguard demonstrated that these converted battleship hulls, while providing large flight decks, created fatal vulnerabilities when damaged, as their multiple ammunition storage areas created opportunities for catastrophic secondary explosions. Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force, suffered the longest agony. Admiral Nagumo's former command burned throughout June 4th, and into the morning of June 5th, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship. But the fires had penetrated too deeply into her structure, reaching aviation fuel storage, tanks and ammunition magazines that fed the flames with explosive intensity. At 4:50 hours on June 5th, Captain Aoki made the heartbreaking decision to scuttle his ship. The destroyer Nawaki fired a single torpedo into Akagi's starboard side, and the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor rolled over and sank stern first into 4,000 fathoms of Pacific water. With her went not only a ship but the myth of Japanese naval invincibility. The statistics told the story of Japan's catastrophic defeat. 4 fleet aircraft carriers totaling 113,000 tons had been lost, along with 3 122 aircraft, and many of Japan's most experienced pilots. The Imperial Navy's first air fleet, which had terrorized Allied forces from Hawaii to Ceylon, had ceased to exist in a single day of battle. Japan's push into the Pacific had reached its absolute limit at a tiny coral atoll called Midway, where American determination and superior intelligence had achieved what many thought impossible: the decisive defeat of the Rising Sun's most elite naval forces. 3 days after the battle, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato received the final confirmation that Japan's Pacific offensive had not merely been stopped, but completely reversed. The architect of Pearl Harbor, who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months, watched that prediction come true with devastating precision. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented more than ships and aircraft. It marked the death of Japan's trained naval aviation cadre that had taken decades to develop. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived Midway only because of appendicitis, later calculated that Japan lost 110 veteran pilots at Midway, including irreplaceable squadron and division leaders, who carried the institutional knowledge of naval aviation warfare. Emperor Hirohito received news of the defeat in his private chambers at the Imperial Palace, where Admiral Asami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, struggled to explain how Japan's invincible fleet had been so completely destroyed. The Emperor's response, recorded in court documents discovered after the war, revealed his understanding that Japan's strategic position had fundamentally changed. The Navy has suffered a crushing defeat from which recovery will be extremely difficult. Edwin Hoyt's biographical study How They Won the War in the Pacific documented that Yamamoto himself recognized Midway as the turning point, privately telling his staff that Japan must now fight a defensive war while seeking negotiated peace terms. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific theater within weeks. Australia, which had faced imminent invasion threat after the fall of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, could now shift forces from defense to offense. American industrial production, already accelerating toward wartime peaks, gained precious time to deploy new Essex-class carriers and train replacement pilots without fear of Japanese interference. For the United States Navy, Midway represented validation of pre-war strategic concepts that emphasized intelligence gathering, coordinated attacks, and technological innovation over numerical superiority. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, issued a simple statement that captured the battle's significance. The enemy has been defeated with heavy losses. Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. The 4 proud carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor terrorized the Indian Ocean and seemed poised to dominate the Pacific had become war graves in the space of 6 hours. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now rested in the eternal darkness 4 miles beneath the Pacific surface, their shattered hulks serving as monuments to the hubris of empire and the decisive power of intelligence, courage, and superior tactics. Japan would build new carriers and train new pilots, but never again would the Rising Sun's naval forces approach Allied territory with the confidence of inevitable victory. The Battle of Midway had not only stopped Japan's eastward expansion but begun the long, bloody retreat toward the home islands that would end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay, the sun that had risen so brilliantly over the Japanese Empire after Pearl Harbor began its inexorable setting on June 4, 1942, when 4 aircraft carriers carrying the dreams of Pacific conquest slipped forever beneath the waves near a tiny atoll called Midway. Japan's push into the Pacific had ended not with the conquest of Hawaii or the American West Coast, but with the fall of 4 proud carriers and the pilots who had made them legends.